We're a charity, and we are here already for more than a decade now. And one of our main scopes is to promote the philosophy of yoga, tantric principles and ideas, the general concept of spirituality. For this, we offer plenty of free classes. I think now we are on 6 free classes a week, Oxford and London. We offer these free talks, and we're very happy to be part of something so wonderful, supporting people's lives and transformation. My name is Foca and I'm one of the teachers here. We are a group of more than 30 of us who are teaching and part of program teaching. And today we speak about optimism, which is a very necessary ingredient in today's world. But I have a suggestion. Before we start, we just take a moment to interiorize, fully settle here. For those who have this here and perception of a greater whole, universal wisdom, you can connect to that and just take a moment to feel this alignment and heart. So let's just begin with a quiet moment, aligning our presence here within a greater whole, within a greater harmony. Ready? There was a great saint called Saint Augustine. He was one of the fathers of the desert. And he came with a fundamental idea, which we can keep it somehow as the fourth idea of our talk today. He said like this: pray as if the entire work is dependent on God, and work as if the entire work is dependent on you. Breaking here one of the fundamental misconceptions about optimism, that optimism is a bit like the happy hippie thing, and with a lot of self-affirmation. Wake up in the morning and tell yourself you can do it, and speak to yourself in the mirror, motivate you know the stories, they're everywhere. And an interesting research found something fascinating about these people. They're actually more depressed. They're actually looking hard because they say these things and it's not really aligned with the reality they live in. So they try to create an optimistic reality, but it's not there. And very often, there is a tint of naivety, of this kind of escapism from reality, ignoring it to a certain extent. That's really not what optimism is about. And just to get a bit in the mood, I don't know if you're familiar with, it kind of was a joke story. So there were the pessimist, the optimist, and the realist walk. And the optimist says, I see the light in the end of the tunnel. And the pessimist says, all I see is the darkness in the tunnel. And the realist says, I think all three of us are screwed because there's a train coming towards us. Now, you would say, obviously, that optimistic character wasn't very aligned there. And we call this idea the radical optimism because it's a radical optimism which is founded, and is the fundamental of it is based on actually what it is, and on constantly aiming to find creative solutions. Optimism is a conscious choice. That's fundamental. You don't just get optimistic. You choose to be optimistic. Very often, the biggest problem lies in the very beginning. The fact that we feel we have no choice. Things happen to us. I don't know about you, but I'm a big fan of Winnie the Pooh. Not just Winnie, but the whole story is there. It's fundamental. Actually, it shows very beautiful some fundamental archetypes of characters. You remember the little donkey, Eeyore? Which always is very difficult for him. I mean, he has some wicked humor, I must say. I liked Eeyore very much. But he's a character. It's the character of the victim, which a victim inevitably will lead to the character of the loser. The one who is constantly a victim of outer circumstances, of things just happen, you know those. And sometimes that happens to us. We feel very much a victim and there's nothing we can do. Nothing I can do. And hence, let me at least cry about it. Let me at least complain a little bit about it. Let me at least wallow in my misery. Give me that satisfaction. But we don't understand that the attitude of a victim is becoming then the fundamental substrata of passivity in our life, and will lead us to a place in which we cannot transform. We're having some sound effects to the talk, or some bells. No. So I was wondering, maybe we had do some, like in YouTube, you say something and there's like to. So this idea of being a victim is something that is so rooted nowadays. We have like institutions of victims together, which I'm not saying bad things don't happen, but still we need to cultivate the fundamental attitude of action, because that's the way in which we can solve it. And one of the best examples I found about it in literature is the story of Viktor Frankl in his book A Man's Search for Meaning. He's a Jewish psychoanalyst, fantastic mind, put there in a concentration camp. He had plenty of reason to complain. Really. I mean, he could write a book of complaints. And his title of the story is The Existential Approach of a Psychotherapist in a Concentration Camp. And he managed to overcome all the hardships and to alchemize them, to transform them, to grow as a human being, that his entire system then radicalized the life of tens and thousands, hundreds of thousands in the school of logotherapy, because he understood there's a fundamental shift. I can choose how I react. I can choose in how I receive my life. Because we have the idea of reception is passive. It's not. Reception or receiving whatever comes in our life is always giving us a choice. And the optimist will have there a moment of awareness that says, what do I do with it? And that's the key point. From there we can start. Because if you know, this Eeyore character, let's say is your friend, the complaining donkey there. And then he meets you and you're full of optimistic and you tell him, be optimistic. And he looks at you, yeah, right. You don't help them. Really, you just piss them off. Let's be honest. It happened to all of us, no? But then it is in the beginning that one needs to catch it, and it's the openness to find solutions. There is a rigidity of the pessimist, which is never saying is a pessimist. I never met anybody who declares themselves pessimist. They declare themselves realists, right? Nobody says, I am a declared pessimist. I always see the bad, and this is how I am, because this is how I believe the world is. I mean, nobody declares himself, I believe so, I hope so. But the realist who says, no, this is just the way things are. There's no other way. Well, the optimist having the possibility of choice from the very beginning, say, okay, that way isn't possible, but maybe there's other ways. Who knows? a little bit of a mystery in life. And I'll give you here another story about a very optimistic estate manager, or lord of an estate. They had this, here in England, they have this very strange sport. They throw plates and they shoot. Very common. And the problem was, they were liking this, and the Lord were inviting all his friends to shoot those plates, and there's a lot of money, all those plates. And not only that, it's pretty messy. And you have in a weekend like this, you'll have 500 plates in your forest and all broke to pieces. And those that they missed, they went really far and he didn't know what to do. And then he collected everybody in his mansion, including the one who cleans the floor. Everybody. He said that this is the situation. Let's come with some ideas. And they come with ideas, nothing and good. And then the cleaning lady says, if I was that plate, I would be frozen to death. And they look at it and say, now that's an idea. Ice plates, they don't cost nothing and they melt. And that was it. It's now made of ice. Now, you see, it looks like, but there is no other solution. The things are flying. You need to shoot them. What will you do? But already the idea of maybe there is a solution. Opening ourselves for that. Not ignoring the problem. Nobody ever solved anything by ignoring the problem, but there is the possibility to say, hey, well, maybe there is a way. And this kind of attitude keeps us extremely alive. Because you know what? It's not true that the optimist always succeeds. Because they lose many battles, but they always win the war. In a good way, because they always take life experiences as a possibility of learning. There is a false myth that says you'll become wiser with age. Doesn't really happen for many. The real thing is you'll be wiser in according to how much you have lived. And then yes, the amount of years gives you more possibilities to live, to make, to learn from experience. And optimism is the ability of looking at each and every life situation as a possibility to learn. And that's a radical shift already. Because it could be that you will fail in some. It could be that you will confront many difficulties. But you take everything as a possibility to learn. You're alive in the experiences. Because what happens to the pessimist, what happens to the victim, what happens to the loser, they retract from life. I cannot do anything. C'est la vie. And they will never even mobilize themselves to find a solution. Now, it's true. Not always they will find a solution, the optimistic. But in the process, they will start to acquire fundamental lessons. They will start to acquire fundamental inspirations. They will become wiser. And an optimist is someone who learns from mistakes. Confucius said, a mistake is to act and not to learn from the mistake you made. If you did a mistake and you learned, it is not a mistake anymore. I'll give you an easy one. How many of you have seen the little ones starting to walk? The toddlers standing up and starting to walk. You've seen, no? Mothers or nephews, and we were in the same situation. Now imagine that little toddler is this kind of Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. He's this kind of loser, and he starts to walk, and he's like, oh! Falls, because they always fall like this, and it's super cute. And it falls, and he says, oh, this walking business isn't for me. I understand you all do it, but keep it for yourself. I'm pretty good in crawling. Look at me. Let's just keep things as they are. It doesn't really happen to them. I had never met a baby who said, forget about it. They come, they don't care, and tuck, they are up again, do another step and a half, pretty clumsily fall, and they stand again. They very quickly learn from their mistakes. They adjust, and with each and every step, they learn more. They're very optimistic about their ability to walk. And look at all of us now. We do it pretty well. It's inherent in us. It is in our core being to be like that, to do like that. we just forget a bit about it. We forget and then we contract. It's the mind that contracts us and says, no, this is impossible. And we constantly refrain and we get to this very unique British hobby of complaining together. We love to do it in this country. I'm not from this country, but one of the things that I noticed is like when two people meet, it's like, oh, what shall we do? Oh, let's complain together. I mean, they don't usually say it, but they find something. Now they complain it's too hot. 2 weeks ago, they complained it was raining. Then they complain about the politics. All the time you can complain about politics. It's a great thing as a topic to complain about. And then there is this kind of, let's find a common denominator of common complaining. We feed one another. It's a culture of complaint. It's a culture of that. And if you look a bit optimistic, you're one of those happy hippies, eh? No fun there. And you retract. I mean, they don't let any more people who have that. Because you look like a weirdo if you're optimistic nowadays. This is why in this building, optimism is not just allowed, but it is indicated. And this is something that, you see, these fundamental attitudes of conscious choice, of realizing that life is, we can learn only if we take it, is exactly what makes optimism the fundamental tool of overcoming crisis. We all had a few good ones lately. We have personal crisis, we have universal crisis, we have plenty of crisis. I mean, it's every time I open the paper, which happens once a week when I go on the train, it's always there is a crisis somewhere there. They convince us there's a crisis. We're always in a crisis mentality. Optimism is one of the greatest tools to defeat that, to overcome it, to learn from it. Because in a way, crisis is fundamental in our development. Do you remember teenage years? Unfortunately, we do remember teenage years. They were full of crisis, existential crisis, because you are not anymore a boy. In my case, you're not a man with a woman. You don't know yet how to position yourself. Everything is... And exactly, I mean, usually we are very pessimistic, but exactly the attitude of optimism is that this is part of my growth. This is a test that is making me stronger. Nobody had a way around tests. Look at Christianity. Jesus Christ. He had a test there. And when the devil took him to the desert, 40 days of no eating and that, he wasn't like, oh, poor me. I'm here to save humanity. And 40 days I didn't have Doritos or nachos, nothing. Such a tough life. Didn't take that. So he took him there 40 days, 40 nights as his spiritual challenge. And this is why he was adequate. He was put there as a symbol, as a model. Moses had the same. Moses has a numerous tests there. Abraham, if you look, the Bible is full of tests. And it's not that God is playing their Love Island or whatever thing. Like, let's see what happens to them. I mean, it is because in the creation of this world as we know it, in order for us to grow, tests are always given. And then we created even a whole industry of it. We call it gyms. Because if you would go to the gym and you will just stay there because there's nice people looking around and they're all sweating and dressed, you will not get much muscles. No? You go there to challenge yourself. Right? If you just lift something that is made of air, what will you challenge? You just look nice for the others, but you don't challenge anything. So how will you grow? The optimistic one can see that life events and activities are exactly those gyms that we are going to. They're exactly the possibility for us to get stronger. And I tell you, read that book of Viktor Frankl. He got out of that experience of being, I think it was 2 years in a concentration camp. Now, indestructible inside. Because he took each and every challenge. He described there in detail the challenge. Him praying that in the soup that day there will be a few peas, because that's the only food he will get. And he describes there exactly the way how people who had genuine optimism survived. People who had this naive optimism said, oh, by Christmas we will be set free. and it didn't happen, they died because they had the false optimism. They had the optimism that was based on an exterior savior. But those people who had an optimism based on inner values, on genuine faith, on a conscious choice, they survived. And this is a great shift. This is why we call it radical optimism. Because the optimism that we are kind of taught nowadays is a bit of a wishy-washy approach. It's a radical optimism in which one acquires the fundamental values and realizes the power that we have within us. Now, optimism is one of the fundamental qualities of any spiritual hero or heroine. And on the path, that kind of the path of life, and specifically the spiritual path of growth, we are always given fundamental ways or chances to prove character. Now, I've looked a little bit, even in the preparation for this talk, I said, what movie can I look which is very optimistic? Can you guess? Okay, I'll give you a hint. Mel Gibson. Braveheart. Now, anyhow, it's not fully based on a real story, but the story there is great. That guy is pretty optimistic there. Said, that we are few. I don't even wear an underwear here. But like, what can we do here? But he was filled with optimism. You would see it's in the backbone of his heroic state. He's extremely optimistic. And he's active. He doesn't just wait. He's constantly acting. There's a constant impetus. What can I do with this situation? Things become harder, let me do that. And that's a state. And we are all very attracted to that kind of character. Not just because of the blue eyes in the case of Mel Gibson. But if you think about it, if you look at movies and archetypes, especially in the last 10 years, it started to diminish. But movies that still had archetypal characters, we are always drawn to this kind of people, which heroism springs from them. There is an ideal, and they are very optimistic they will complete it. And very often they don't. But my God, they transform in the process. And they inspire others. And eventually, things are transforming. They're extremely optimistic about it. Look at Gandhi. As Churchill called him, the half-naked fakir. Imagine he walks into a room, all of them like those British with suits and ties and all the cigars, and this 50 kilos with little glasses comes in the room. They all like, this guy. He seriously was optimistic. Read his book, My Experiments with the Truth. He speaks about exactly that. He said, no way. Spiritual ideals will lose in front of human oppression. Spiritual ideals will always win. He put there in his book, you can read it, Yama Niyama, the fundamental laws of moralities in yoga and tantra. This is the way we will transform India. First they laughed at him, then they talked to him, and eventually he won. Now, it was an inherent optimism that fueled this heroic way of being. Because heroism nowadays is not in wars. Wars is now played like computer games. The real heroism is the ability of taking full responsibility for our life. Consciously choosing the way we are acting. And then that will be the fundamental, optimism will be the fundamental attitude that will drive us forward. There is another story. In that story is the story that happens in the Bhagavad Gita. Sits there Arjuna, which is the leader of the army, and in front of him there's another army of his cousin. It's an epic, and it's the mother of all Bollywoods. It's literally the longest book in the world. In there is a dialogue between Krishna, which is a hypostasis of the divinity, and Arjuna there, and they talk. And Arjuna said, I don't want to fight. I don't want to act Because in front of him was his cousins, like in any good Bollywood story. It's a lot of emotions there, and I don't want to go through this. And Krishna tells him, boy, action is superior non-action, and the only way is to act. So, here you go. And not only he tells him that, he said, a real way of acting is to stay equal in front of praise and shame. To stay equal in front of pleasure and pain. You see, the state of being genuinely optimistic creates a profound sense of equanimity. Because you are equal inside in front of two aspects that look contradictory. Because the one who is constantly assigning aspects to their ego, when they win, it's just me. When they lose, it's everybody else's fault. The one who is genuinely optimistic can really see that everything is part of a unique lesson. And the success and failures are to a certain extent as valuable in this lesson. Hence, you are equal in front of them. You will always, of course, aim to have a successful outcome. I mean, otherwise, what's the point? But in the same time, you're equal in front of both. And it sets us free. It sets us fundamentally free because we are so afraid of failure that we don't act. There is such a fear of not succeeding that we don't even start. One of the things that I'm doing is guiding groups of men. And I am having a lot of one-to-one conversation with men, which are the minority in this room. I don't know, maybe they feel they don't need to be optimistic. But anyhow. Or maybe they feel they're optimistic enough. And men often are afraid to approach women. Because usually they come to me if they don't have a girlfriend. If they have a girlfriend, usually. If they have a girlfriend, they come to talk only if something went bad. I mean, that's the two reasons. Either they don't have a girlfriend or something is going bad. I mean, that's the main two reasons why men come and speak. Anyhow. They have this fundamental fear that they will fail. And it's so rooted in them that they don't even try. And then they prove their point. They always come, I proved my point. Look, it happened, I failed. Well, obviously you failed. You didn't even properly try. Yeah, but I came close to her. Did you say hello? No, but I made it clear that I had the intentions. Come on. Because we are so afraid of failure. We're so afraid of acting. There is an anxiety problem in today's world. And not by chance, by the way, especially in men. Because we measure, as men, we measure ourselves by what we do. And if we're so afraid of failing, we don't do anything, and then our measure is 0. And it creates a certain form of this petrifying state. So if you are in that state, always remember that you were once this size and you started walking. You didn't have a worry of failure. You weren't like, Mom is going to laugh if I fail, but let me... I mean, you didn't have that. It's a later development, and we say, oh, you know, it will happen like this. It's not. And only the one who failed enough times and learned from them is a triumphant human being. Now, optimism is a fundamental quality which is connected to faith, and thus the certain connection to a higher power is creating a fundamental state of optimism. Not by chance, when they created the 12-stage method for Alcoholics Anonymous and all of those anonymous groups, they indicated the value of faith because faith creates a thread of optimism. Because in the beginning, you don't start and you're like, I'm fully optimistic, but you have at least a little bit of it. And then it can gradually multiply and grow in your being. Because like anything, it doesn't grow from 0 to 100 in a second. It's not a jaguar. For most of us, it's a little donkey. But that little donkey, even if it goes a bit slow, if it goes in the right direction, then it's okay. And having just a little bit of, finding a genuine form of faith, regardless in what, but finding that is probably the most accessible way in finding optimism. realizing that there could be a higher wisdom, that there is a higher intelligence, that there is a reason for this. Because often the pessimists are those ones who don't find a greater meaning, who are also, to a certain extent, very materialistic in their approach, very confined to only that which they see. They cannot feel or sense anything beyond. And then they also, you can say, they limit the reality. And without faith, very difficult optimism will be. You might have those naive optimistics, like in the joke in the beginning, who see the light in the end of the tunnel and don't realize it's the train coming quickly at them. And that's a radical shift. Hence, finding faith. And in order to find faith, you need to look for it. Otherwise, ask questions, interiorize, generally contemplate. That's one of the keys for becoming more optimistic and starting having optimism in our life. Now, optimism will propagate, like pessimism. And we need to choose what we propagate, obviously, but to also expand it to other areas of our life. Because I saw people who seemingly are very optimistic about one area, and then they're pessimistic about all the rest. And it's not real optimism. They are naive about one, and they're at least a bit more honest about the other. Genuine optimism that we cultivate in one area of our life will express in all of them, because it is about us. So if you're optimistic about your work, you're optimistic about relationships, you start to have a bit of it, you will start to see how it expands in all areas of life. And that's exactly what we're aiming for. Because often the unconscious choices create an unconscious pessimism that is in everywhere. And here it's back to the beginning, conscious choice, thus we can propagate it in our life. Now, sometimes we need to encourage ourselves. I don't know how about you, but I take periodically time by myself. I did more or less in the last 20 years of practice, I spent 2 years by myself, completely by myself, in a retreat. I mean, kind of accumulated, not in one go. And once I asked myself, why on earth am I doing it so much? I mean, I'm a bit alone here. There's nothing going on. It's not alone with Netflix. I mean, it's completely alone, in silence, only meditating, and nothing else. So why on earth am I doing it? I mean, genuinely asking myself in a moment which was difficult. And I was like kind of contemplating it. And I realized that exactly in those moments, I'm invited to contemplate my life. And I realized, where do I get the power from somehow in those moments, which is difficult? I look back. I look back to all the transformation that happened in my life. I look back to how I was, and I can see how I am. And that immediately fills me with optimism about what I can be. If you want to be optimistic, look how much you have transformed. Look at you as a baby and say, if I manage to become from that to this, there is hope. If you want to be pessimistic, always look at the horizon as an impossibility. Oh, this will never happen. You know, this is a utopia. It can only happen out there in dreams. If you believe that, that's exactly what will happen. Like people have with, for example, the idea of spiritual realization. It can happen only to those very special people in the caves. Me, maximum I will realize how I feel. That will be a good thing for me. Well, if you don't believe it, it won't happen. Like Ford said. If you really believe, determines your life. If you don't believe you can ever become that, you will not ever become that. This is why it is so fundamental that when we want to gather optimism, you can look back and see the transformation that you have. I want to recommend you here journaling. I've been writing my life for the last 23 years. Not every day, but kind of my life. And every time, exactly when I said in those retreats, I look back and said, oh, there's great reasons for optimism. Because what I thought beforehand would be impossible, well, now pretty possible. I live that. I said, okay, but maybe also that. which seemingly is so impossible, like the idea of spiritual enlightenment or liberation, realization, big words that you find in all the books, maybe, just maybe, there is a possibility, because if I manage to do that, I can also do this. Hence, optimism will rise from that. Now, as said, optimism is a unique way of seeing the world. And Helen Keller said something beautiful about it. She said that the only thing worse than being blind is having sight but no vision. And you see, it's changing our perspective will radicalize the way life unfolds. And often we don't actually see reality, we see our version of reality. And we contaminate reality with our version, and then easily we become a victim of it. And then here is the famous example with the farmer and the shovel. You know this one? Then I'll tell you. So there was a farmer, and like any farmer, he really likes his farm, so his wife for his birthday got him a new shovel. How happy was the farmer, every day shoveling around and loving his shovel very much. One day, the shovel wasn't there. Very suspicious was our farmer. Then he looked around and he saw his neighbor. And his neighbor looked very peculiar at that moment. And he thought, look at him, he walks a bit like a thief. So he started his quest. And he was observing the farmer when he was eating dinner with his wife. And he's like, he even eats like a thief. And he was observing everything. He does this like a thief and that. And then after a few weeks, his wife, like any good wife, was arranging the tool shed and she found the shovel that fell behind one of the benches. Happily, the farmer went and regained his work with his shovel, and then he looked at his neighbor and said, very odd. He stopped walking like a thief. How we color our life. We believe so much that something is happening that it becomes that. We colored it to that extent that that nice neighbor became a thief for a few days. Just when we realized, oh, actually it wasn't a thief, it's the way I looked at the things. Hence this fundamental shift in acquiring vision, realizing, hey, actually I'm not a victim. It's not that the neighbor looks like somebody who's against me, they're against me, they're against me. Maybe it's me. And this fundamental shift in perspective, which is a shift in the way we see, will be the one that will enable us to live a much more optimistic life. And a life which is filled with optimism will have this tint of success in it. A real success, a success that is infused in all areas of our life, that is real fulfillment. You never see someone who is fulfilled and happy and is so pessimistic and depressed. It cannot be. And you think, oh, they are happy because they are so successful. No. They are successful because they are so happy, because they are so optimistic. Then they become. That is the actual unfolding of it. And this one we can control. Success is a byproduct. It's not about us. We can create all the conditions for it. The rest is not ours. Even the idea of success is very individualized. We try now to put everything in the same frame of success. I mean, that's the whole American dream. They put an image, success looks like, ta-da! And you compare yourself accordingly. It's a very limited idea of success. Very limited. And it killed generations, killed in their heart. Because success is individual. You need to create the conditions. One of the fundamental pillars there is exactly that of optimism. Optimism is about merging ideals and the power of action. Optimism is merging ideals and the power of action. Ideals is our ability of superior sight, one can say, an ability of infusing life with principle, and then acting accordingly. Because there are people who can act, but they don't have the vision of how to act and why they act. And then there is those who have great ideas and ideals in their life, but they don't have the oomph to manifest them. The latter will be slightly impotent. The former will be going around in circles because it doesn't have a direction. A real optimistic character is the one who is able to infuse both. Having a clear ideal merged with the power of genuine action. Thus, when having that, one can realize how the condition for all solutions are found within. And sometimes you might lose battles, but you always know that you will win the war. In your life, you always know that eventually these things have a unique purpose in them. There is a reason for it. You can see the meaning. Optimism is helping us to discover the hidden meaning that is behind. Now you see, being optimistic and choosing optimism will infuse three fundamental levels of our being which are interwoven. What we believe, the emotions we have, and the thoughts that we constantly feed. Exactly in the level of belief, we have the power to make the change. And I'll give you an easy example. A belief that we have, I will never have any more relationships in my life. This relationship ended and it was perfect, even if it sucked, but it feels perfect for 1 minute, and then hence it's a belief that we have in those moments. You recognize friends who had it. And then after we had this belief, comes an emotion, or sometimes even behind that belief there is an emotion, because they feed one another. And the emotion that will be there is, I'm not worthy of love. It's a very low self-esteem. It's an emotion of being meaningless, right? And out of this will come thoughts like, love doesn't really exist. It's all a kind of a fairy tale. It's all hopeless. I am worthless. Love is not for me. I heard that quite recently lately. It went out of fashion, love. I don't know how, it's such a good thing, but it went out of fashion. Now I heard many people, love is not for me. Exactly. And it is fed by the way in which something happened, a relationship ended. Who here didn't have a relationship that ended and they suffered? It's an anomaly. Everybody had a relationship which were difficult, no? We all share tears about love. And then what happens? We create a belief that which happened is what will always happen, because it happened. We have a proof it happened. Realistically, this has happened. And then we extrapolate. Say, if this happened, it will always happen, because it's also connected to our emotional impetus at that moment. We feel really bad. It's obviously it happens. And we feed those thoughts, and thoughts will create more and more system of belief, stronger and stronger emotions, and you see where the cycle is, and it's a reactive cycle. We haven't chose. We haven't acted and says, no, 1 second, let me look back. There was a success story. Let me look around. I can choose to be different. Let me have faith. And then we can change the cycle. Otherwise, this vicious cycle, as its name, is extremely vicious, and it kills us. And we create a reality which we feel like nothing, which we don't have love, which we constantly suffer, isn't it? And it happens to so many, and you cannot just tell them, be optimistic. They have all the good criteria why they shouldn't be optimistic. They come with a list because they prepare it to themselves, because inside of them they know that they could do better. But still, all the facts that they brought up in their inner discussion shows that, no, it's impossible. Optimism is always remembering that there is this possibility. It's a massive shift, and optimism will create a virtuous circle, because you choose differently, and then immediately you will have an emotion of it's possible, and the thoughts that will come from it, how can I act accordingly? What can I do now for that? And this, of course, will feed a whole different cycle in our being. If you have any questions before we move to 7 conclusions and practical aspects, and then we will as well have a short experiment with one of these conclusions.
when you're around people or people in close proximity that aren't optimistic, what the tool you use to maintain a balance?
Well, I had plenty of these opportunities. You see, I am Israeli, and we have plenty of those meetings. And sometimes pessimism really governs, especially when they speak about politics. And I really understand why everybody are pessimistic, because it's been decades of really no progress, only stagnation, hatred, and war. It's tough. I mean, beyond the joke that, it's really tough in those moments. And exactly then, personally, I refer to the fact that there is always this possibility of shifting it within. And I'm focusing only on shifting it within. I try not to convince anybody that that's a good idea. I shifted within, and then through the power of example, it can inspire others. But I never do these pep talks of optimism. Not necessarily, but it's an inner process. It's a decision within to be optimistic, to find constantly an optimistic outlook, to really look for faith in that moment. Personally, for me, I believe in God. I believe from a very young age. And I feel it very intimate. And when I feel that, that's for me, it's the easiest way. I must say, the idea, it's hard for me to be optimistic in this moment as a start. So first I relate to my faith. And I believe that, okay, it's trouble, but there is a reason for it. We are here to learn something. And kind of connecting to the idea of faith and higher power, universal wisdom. And then through that, I start to become optimistic. It's very difficult, but from my experience, to immediately be optimistic when you read the papers and it's again the same news for the last 3 decades, 4 decades, exactly the same problem. But then yes, I often sometimes as well look at it from a bigger perspective. You zoom out a little bit. During the Black Death, it lasted quite a few years. They were sure that everybody will die. That was it. And even that we passed as humanity. To say, okay, we really passed through some difficult things, but even that we passed. And there's a certain inherent faith in the outcome which will be beneficial and good, because I believe in a creator which is good and kind, which lets us the ability of making mistakes, hence we suffer. But that there is, in essence, in the end, there will be a triumph of that which is of the good, both in my life and in the world. Now you can say it's a naive belief, but I notice it so many times in micro moments. Those moments when everything looks so bad and you say, no, you know what? We will manage, like in Braveheart or in other things. You have this inner feeling, and you know that feeling actually worked. And then I extrapolate, say, also in big parts, like, for example, the conflict there, having faith that even that will be solved. So that's personally what I do, especially when you are in those difficult situations. And I said, pessimism is a much stronger plague than COVID was ever. It's a hobby nowadays. It's like, with science being the new religion, pessimism is the credo. And yeah, we're salmon fishes here being optimistic and not being hippies. It's difficult because they kind of categorize even the optimistic as those wishful thinkers. Well, not, there is another way of being optimistic, radically different. Seven practical tools that we can use to become more optimistic in our life. First one is, of course, being grateful. Gratitude is a state. Have you seen the movie with Anthony Quinn, Zorba the Greek? It won an Oscar in 1965. The book is even better. Nobody here saw the movie? Zorba the Greek, Anthony Quinn. Oh, So here is the last scene and a big spoiler for all of us here in the room. So in that movie, which actually is a wonderful book, Nikos Kazantzakis, he described there a whole hardship of making a mine in Crete. And the thing finishes when everything collapsed. It's the worst possible outcome. And then you have there Zorba, who is the Greek manager, and the master, the one who has all the money and so forth, the Englishman who came with all the funds. They sit together, and the master asks the other, Zorba, and now what? And Zorba looks and says, and now we dance. And the movie ends with them dancing there on the shores of Crete. And you look at the movie and you say, but that was a very bad outcome. They spent all their money, all their time, and in a good 2.5 hours, because it's a long movie, and in the end, nothing. But everything happened there. Because they were having a moment of gratitude for this moment that exists. They were simply grateful. And the ability of being grateful in an equal way in front of hardships and success is a genuine one. Because if we believe in omnipresent or an omnipotent power, He's always there. You're grateful for both. And being grateful for both and the hardships exactly is a conscious choice that removes us from being a victim and enables us to start to act in an optimistic way. The second practical aspect and indication is humor. Now, not by chance, humor and humbleness and being human, humor, humbleness, and human come from the same root, which means home, which means sod or from the earth. Showing this is something fundamental in us, and specifically with humbleness and humor, there is a very important link, because the ability of laughing at one's own self in the moment, not just in an afterthought, because it's very easy to laugh at ourselves. Oh, when I was like that, and I was so silly, and I was crying for that guy, and now I feel... But in that moment to say, I will laugh at that. And in that moment even to laugh a bit about ourselves. Release us from this over-seriousness. Because very often in today's world, we take the important things lightly and the light things seriously. Like, for example, our image on Facebook or Instagram or all those other things. And with the serious things like actually how I feel, we don't give the same attention, but how I look in the picture, my God. So you see, having this real ability happens. So having this real ability of being humble and humoristic about ourselves frees us from that. And very often, being optimistic will create a certain kind of dynamism. You know, you open yourself, you have a certain kind of lightness in you, which enables you to find a new solution, like with that plate made of ice, which will make it so that you're more adaptable and flexible, like MacGyver. You remember MacGyver in the 80s? Who was here living in the 80s? MacGyver. Nobody remembers MacGyver. Anyhow, this guy who always got into trouble and always mysteriously found a solution with very little things and solved everything. That state in which you become light, because being humoristic, you're not attached to your plan. Being very humble, you're not confined by this tyranny of the mind. You start to set yourself free. And that creates a certain dynamism in the process. The third practical aspect is about being ourselves. Optimism is and can only be created authentically. Yes, you can be inspired by other people's optimism, but you cannot take their optimism, because your optimism will be tinted by your specific nuance. Some are more expressive, some are more introverted, but they can be as optimistic. Right? And then being ourselves is exactly where we find our way of being optimistic. And as Oscar Wilde wonderfully put, be yourself, everyone else is taken. So the idea here is very simple, that you find within you a genuine manifestation of that optimism. So it's not something that you aim to try to imitate, the fake it till you make it. You can never do it with optimism. You'll become naive in your optimism, this form of optimism. But the real optimism finds when you are aware of those powers within you. And then you can start to mobilize them. Because mobilizing inner powers comes only, or is a consequence of the awareness of the gifts that we are inherited with. And optimism is one of the tools that will enable us to decode those gifts, to bring them out, to shaken them, to bring them to the surface. Fourth indication is moving from reaction to action. A reaction is the loser, victim, happens to me. Action is, these things happen, what is my attitude? How do I choose to act? Reaction is very much like today algorithm work. They calculate how we are. This is how advertising work. They calculate us how we will react to that image, and we all react to it. You put a bit of breast there and something that looks nice, everybody buy it. Ta-da! It's so horrible in the way we are predictable until we wake up. Until we choose not to react and we look at it and said, that's manipulation. I will not buy this silly toothbrush or toothpaste, whatever they are trying to sell to me. Because I act. You look at the things differently. Now, this is just a simple example, but this power is fundamental. You're in a discussion. Often the problem in discussion, we go reactive, right? This leads to that, which leads to that, and then it goes into a big bomb. You act, you say, what actually is, what I am trying to say? What is actually springing from my heart? This ability, which is exactly as we said in the beginning, optimism is a conscious choice, is the awareness that we put in the beginning of any action. Exactly there, we can move from being active to reactive. Now, one of the problems in doing this today is choice. We have too much choice. It happens, for example, when people look on whatever, Netflix, Prime, Disney, half the time they just, what shall I see? Or how do I do that? And it's just so many choices. Adam, when he looked at Eve, he didn't swipe left or swipe right. It was a certitude there. And he acted. He came and said, do you come here often? And, it's alive. You act accordingly. Now, the problem today, we have so many choices. We have this stupid FOMO, of fear of missing out, that we don't do anything. We spend our time, we don't do, because we are so afraid of failure, as we said beforehand. And acting, even if your action might not be perfect, you start and mobilize the power of action inside of you. And then you will find a way. Being afraid of action or being reactive and just going on automatic pilot is exactly the way in which we can fortify the stagnation that appears in our life. The fifth one, and I must say this is a very personal one, yoga. Doing yoga is one of the biggest, for me, the biggest tool to become optimistic. Now, why is that? Pessimism, analogically, is born out of a sort of an inertia, which is an inertia which works very much like gravity, but just a bit kind of not as clear, that kind of pulls us down. And sometimes we even feel it. We have a push that we went up. We went into a spiritual camp, or we fell in love, or we had a good push, and then for some mysterious reason, we go down and not continuously up. If we were in space, by the way, we would be continuously going up. But we are on this earth and there is a gravity. The gravity also works subtly, and it pulls us down. We have a peak experience and then... Now, we cannot rely on peak experiences from the outer world. We cannot rely on sunny days here in England. It just doesn't work. Even if we have a good week ahead of us. It just doesn't work to rely on exterior circumstances. Hence, the only solution is to rely on interior conditions. Right? To create the same conditions to continue the upwards movement. And yoga is one of the best tools for it. Because there will be an inertial force. And then you create an upward stream. And then it's not just you're optimistic while you do a bit of yoga. It propagates in your day. I personally spend half an hour of my day upside down in headstand. Exactly to have that kind of superior perspective, to defeat the gravity, the powers that pulls me down, so I have a continuous vector that takes me up. If not, I'll go down, because there is a fundamental rule here. What doesn't go up will go down. It happens. We need to keep on the upwards flow. Now, wonderfully, when we have things from the exterior that triggers us to go up, but we need to create an interior anchor that keeps continuously the vector of going up. And then when we have impulse of going up, we just go up a nudge, but we continue within a constant upwards flow. Yes, Paul. You had you just said, okay, I thought you raised your hand, but maybe you just scratched something. So, number 6. Evoking moments in which you were optimistic. As said, looking back. Both looking back and realizing, I managed to go through all this. I grew up. I managed to overcome those difficulties. Look what I managed to do. Sometimes we are not aware of that until we meet someone who sheds light on how beautiful we are. We call it falling in love. Because through the eyes of the other one, we fall in love with ourselves because we realize how many beautiful things we have inside of us. Because they started to see us like that. Now, in this idea, it doesn't mean that we become narcissists. Oh my God, I'm so good. It's about the fundamental idea that you look and you realize, I managed to overcome this. I have those powers within me. I am endowed with this possibility. And even looking at moments in which we were optimistic and we managed to solve those problems or those issues, because they are a trigger for us to reignite that vibration, tuning into the same energy. We call it resonance. Tuning into the same state that is always there within us. And then that revocation brings us back. I mean, I said in the beginning, optimism is like you need to catch the thread of it, and then it will gradually grow and grow and grow. This is another way of catching the thread, evoking those moments, especially when it's difficult. And sometimes you won't have the friend who will tell you, you remember that? You need to have it within. Because some of our most pessimistic moments are appearing when we are by ourselves. And exactly then, we need to be a very good friend of ourselves. And like any friendship, you need to cultivate it. If you haven't been a good friend of yourself because you haven't visited, no wonder that after a few years when you come, you don't have what to say. What happens to people when they are left a bit alone? They're like, what do I do now? Okay, you're by yourself. What isn't it nice? No, what do I do? Because they haven't cultivated that friendship. Hence, cultivate a friendship with yourself, and then when you're alone, you have that good friend that you are buddies with. And then they can remind you, hey, remember about optimism. You had this, you overcame that. Remember that state you had. And then you can propagate it and it will grow. The 7th practical tool is a way in which we can tune in to this fundamental energy of optimism that is based in the fundamental substrate of creation. It says about it's mentioned probably most explicitly actually in the Islamic tradition and in the Hindu tradition. They said that God has 2 fundamental aspects. One of them is the one which he doesn't have any attributes, completely transcendental. And then one which he has attributes, when he creates. And when he created, with the act of creation came all the fundamental qualities. We call them godly attributes, which are like criteria, universal criteria about those fundamental qualities. For example, humbleness, kindness, optimism, love, eros. They are a way in which the Creator infused the creation, gave, I can say, an absolute criteria, because they don't change, they are always the same. And then we in our life can align accordingly. For example, with kindness, it's an absolute attribute there. And we can be 100% aligned with it, or 25% negotiating. And what is this? One of the characteristics of a spiritual journey is that we aim to align everything. And it's answering one of the most cryptic quotes in the Bible, which says that we were made in the image and likeness of God. What do they mean? But God looks like Debbie. What's yeah. Exactly. It's the essence, it's that likeness. He doesn't look like us. It's not like, oh, they took off they had a haircut, let me do the same haircut, so we look alike. I mean, it's not like North Korea, which all have the same haircuts. I mean, it's not the case. The idea is that there is this likeness, this universal aspect, and we are made alike, and then we can choose which, like, the attributes were put there as fundamental criteria, and then it's up to us to align. So there is, in the fundamental bosom of the creation, there is the aspect of optimism, an attribute of optimism. And we can tune in with that. We can tune in with it through a process of meditation or through fundamental actions. In both ways, we are feeding the same way of alignment and tuning. And then when we tune in, you can say, for example, in a meditation, when we tune into that resonance, to that vibration, to that radio station, to that feeling, we can re-evoke it at will. And then it will propagate in our being. And then we move from being an image and likeness of optimism from 20, 25% to 60, 70, 80, 90, 100%. Being alike, logically reflecting the light of the Creator in creation within our being.
Any questions or comments or anything you want to share?
I just want to ask you, do you know you spoke about moving from reaction to action? So it's kind of being proactive. Would that be correct? Would that be a good way to interpret?
Part of it is being proactive. And part of it is the ability of choosing the way we act in a situation. We're not aware, that's exactly the problem, that most of our, what we believe, actions are merely reactions. We are programmed to a certain way there. And action is the ability of saying, what am I doing? What are my ideals in this moment? What I'm doing now is aligned with really what's in my heart, with really what I believe in. No, it's not like every time you open the fridge, you take a Zen moment to meditate. Is it the cucumbers or the tomatoes? But it's, you see, it's a vividness of experiencing life. Otherwise, now they even describe it pretty well in these dystopian movies or this kind of zombie-like societies in which people just act and they are not really alive in it. Basically, we're not acting, we are reacting. We're constantly, that's why I mentioned the idea of the algorithm and the way the AI is. Because the AI, the artificial intelligence, is a replica of a human being which hasn't fully awakened. And they're improving pretty fast with this. But we are actually a replica of someone much beyond that, or something. And that we have both sides. We have side which we can easily, we will replicate eventually in the form of AI, but we're actually a replica of the image and likeness, which that's a choice. The other one is born out of a certain kind of programming. So moving from programming, setting ourselves free from that. And it comes with a very vivid heart, being very alive. And that's fundamental, kind of, especially in the tantric tradition, life, living it. Some people ask, why on earth? You are a spiritual school, which we are, and we organize parties, and we always have this party and these social events. What's going on with you? Well, exactly because of that. Life. Because when you're alive, you can learn, and then you can move from being reactive. But otherwise, the whole idea of diminishing life, the playing it cool, nothing too much, cannot get hurt. Boom, you're already dead. Which unfortunately happens to many.
Just in terms of the meditation. So one of the things that, I know this was a godly attribute meditation, but one of the things that I'm sort of exploring with music is when I listen to a piece of music that I love singing along to, or listening to that just brings me joy, you know. And so it doesn't always have to be a meditative, it can be an open eye process, and you're just listening, and that could just lift your mood to optimism.
Before we came here, we sat in the park. I sat in the park. He also sat in the park. And all I was doing, I was putting this music on and contemplating the trees and the way the light was playing in them. And I was perceiving this optimism that is infused in creation. I was just 20 minutes. Anyhow, I kind of memorize what I have to say. So I said, and yeah, definitely, you just aim to feel it. Because the idea in this is the process of the actual focusing of the mind is in order for you to infuse your structure, what is called the aura, with this particular vibration, what we call resonance. And that's exactly, you can be creative in the way you do it. Or very often with the eyes closed in an inner contemplative state, it's much easier to tune in, but it's not confined to that.
I'm still struggling to understand the seventh practical point, because it sounds like encompassing the gratitude and
it's a very big one, because it's applicable in all fundamental qualities. The idea of tuning into a universal energy, which exists there always as a kind of, as the backbone of creation, as the kind you can say the fabric of it, which enables us to tune into a universal criteria, an ideal, which is always there, like a pillar. It's in a way, it's as Jung described, he called it the universal archetype. It's a form, and this seventh point is equivalent. You can do it with anything. You want to be more enthusiastic, you want to be more heroic, you want to have more love. You connect to a universal form of love, to a universal form of heroism, to a universal form of enthusiasm. That is valid to all. And this is a very practical tool in yoga and tantra to always connect to a universal criteria in order to replicate it in our life. And sometimes optimism, for example, could be a bit abstract, and then you meditate on it. Otherwise, you aim to have an example. We call it even an exemplification. You aim to feel it, and then say, "Aha, that's the feeling of it." And then, like with the thread that I said, you start and you explore, and it becomes bigger, and you understand it. You start to live it.
So you practice in everyday life.
Yes. One of my main practices is trying to tune into which attributes are now. For example, in this one, I chose a few, and I aim to connect to them and to practice them while I speak. It's kind of another program that I have simultaneously running here. But it's just how, it's just the way it is. Because for example, you're with your girlfriend. You don't often choose, let me tune into universal love. You just feel love. But a way of loving it, because that becomes very personal love. A way of loving is like the universe loves. Like all the poets put together in one. And you connect to a universal criteria. And then you aim to evoke that and to manifest that love to that person. So that's a very practical tool that we constantly use in the yogic and tantric tradition.
You said about the social aspect of this, and I was wondering, and that being like living life and all of that, might there be a social conclusion to this in some way?
A social conclusion.
Well, the best is to take Gandhi's "Be the change you want to see." See, optimism is not something that will be propheted or something that will be induced in like missionaries. We are here to give you optimism. Now everybody dance. It won't be propagated so much like this. But being more optimistic, we become an inspiration. And I notice it around. If you are good in being optimistic in that moment, you start to kindle as well the same aspiration in the others. You don't need to say much. You need to be much. And all the idea of a social transformation can only happen with the transformation of the individual. This is why I refer to Gandhi. And in his book, My Experiment with the Truth, is before he became a public figure. He speaks about his practice. And his practice was to be an example. And he became such a good example that 1 billion of them went after. Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, everybody. Because he was a real personal example. And personally, I believe, and it's one of the ways in which our school is kind of trying to influence society. Not by going in the streets as much, but transforming individuals so they become beacons of light. And the more we'll have beacons of light, the more darkness will not prevail anymore. It's one light at a time. That's my 2 cents on the matter.